Welcome to Sacred Conversations, where faith and identity meet. I'm your host, Drew, and before we begin, please like and subscribe so these conversations can reach more people who are searching for clarity, truth, and understanding. Today's episode is titled Faith Beyond Christianity: How Other Religions View Homosexuality. Many people assume that homosexuality is universally condemned across all faith traditions. That belief is widespread in Christian spaces, but it is historically and globally inaccurate. Around the world and throughout history, religions and spiritual systems have held a wide range of views on sexuality and gender, some restrictive, some neutral, and some deeply affirming. So, in this episode, we will explore how several major religious traditions understand same sex relationships, gender diversity, and queer identity. And before we dive in, I want to share a brief preview of next week's episode. As we approach the holiday season, we'll be taking a fresh look at one of the most familiar stories in Christianity, the Nativity. We'll explore its cultural context, the political tension surrounding Jesus' birth, and the themes of marginalization, family, radical welcome, and divine disruption. So, if you've ever wondered what the Nativity means beyond the manger scene, or what it means for people who have often been unwelcome in church spaces, you won't want to miss this episode. Now, let's begin today's conversation. Many Christians growing up, or they grow up believing that homosexuality is condemned across all faiths and cultures. This belief is often presented as if it's universally understood, universally agreed upon, and universally practiced. The assumption becomes, if every religion disapproves of queerness, then queerness must be inherently wrong. However, this perspective is based on limited understanding of world religions and a narrow interpretation of history. You see, when we explore global spiritual traditions, we find that the majority of beliefs about sexuality and gender are much more diverse, complicated, and culturally influenced than many assume. Homophobia is not a universal religious value. While certain modern expressions of Christianity and Islam may teach strict restrictions on same sex relationships, this is not true for every branch of those religions, and it's certainly not true for many other religious traditions. In fact, several ancient cultures integrated queerness into spiritual life, leadership roles, or mythological stories. What many people think as universal condemnation is often a Western colonial or fundamentalist interpretation that developed in specific historical contexts, not a timeless spiritual truth shared across humanity. Understanding other religions helps us understand our own assumptions. When Christians learn how other religions approach queerness, it becomes clear how much of what we have been taught is shaped not only by scripture, but by cultural norms, political history, colonial influence, translation choices, theological traditions, and social fears. This awareness helps Christians distinguish between what the Bible actually says and what culture has layered onto the Bible over centuries. Queer identity is a global historical reality. Queer people have existed in every region of the world, in every historical era, in every major civilization, in every religious community. There's no time in recorded history where queer people did not exist. There's no culture that was entirely heterosexual. There is no religion that has not interacted with queerness in some form. This matters because when queer Christians are told that their identity is unnatural, they often believe it until they discover that queer identity has been present and sometimes honored across global spiritual traditions for thousands of years. Many negative beliefs about homosexuality come from colonial influence, not original religious teachings. In Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas, many indigenous and pre colonial cultures had nuanced understanding of gender and sexuality. Some were affirming, some were neutral, and some assigned queer people sacred roles. But widespread legal condemnation often began with European colonialism, which brought Victorian sexual morality, anti sodomy laws, Christian missionary influence, and Western cultural norms. These laws and beliefs reshaped entire continents, replacing cultural diversity with imported restrictions. Examining other religions provides a broader spiritual lens. By learning how other faiths view sexuality and gender, Christians gain a more informed understanding of global spirituality. A sense of continuity and belonging in human history, the ability to question inherited doctrines without fear, and perspective on how cultural context shapes theology. There's a confidence that queerness does not conflict with divine purpose. So, exploring these perspectives does not mean abandoning Christianity. It means recognizing that Christianity is one voice among many, and that our understanding of sexuality may be shaped by culture as much as by the scripture. This conversation helps queer Christians reclaim their spiritual identity. For many queer people, the belief that every religion condemns homosexuality can lead to deep shame, spiritual abandonment, or fear of exploring faith. Understanding that affirmation exists in many religious traditions, neutrality exists in many religious traditions, and condemnation is often not rooted in ancient teachings. This allows queer Christians to reconstruct a faith identity that honors their humanity rather than suppress it. So, this episode reframes the narrative entirely. Instead of asking, why do all religions condemn homosexuality? The more accurate question becomes, what does global spirituality reveal about the diversity and sacredness of human identity? This shift creates space for rebuilding theology, personal faith, and spiritual belonging. Judaism, in the ancient foundation of Christianity, is yet um, its internal diversity and evolving interpretations often surprise people who grow up hearing only Christian teachings about the Hebrew Bible. When exploring Judaism stance on homosexuality, it's important to understand that Judaism is not a single unified tradition. Instead, it encompasses multiple branches, each with distinct interpretations of scripture, law, and identity. This diversity is essential for understanding how Jewish communities approach sexuality. So, Judaism is a multi branch tradition. It's commonly divided into several major branches. There's Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, Humanistic and Cultural Judaism. These branches vary significantly in how they interpret Torah, the law, Talmud, the oral tradition, and modern ethical questions. This means Judaism does not have one single stance on homosexuality, but multiple perspectives that are grounded in different frameworks of interpretation. The verses in Leviticus, context matters most. Conversations about homosexuality in Judaism reference two passages in Leviticus. Well, two passages, Leviticus 18:22. Leviticus 20 and chapter 20 and verse 13. These verses are part of the Holiness Code, a collection of purity laws given to ancient Israel. So, important context, these laws were specific to Israel's ritual, cultural, and purity boundaries. They included many rules modern Judaism no longer practices, literally. For example, clothing, regulations, agricultural mixing, sacrificial requirements. The text addresses a very specific male sexual act, not sexual orientation or committed same sex relationships. the verses do not address female same sex relationships at all. Modern scholars also note that the Hebrew phrasing is ambiguous and may refer to ritual, taboos, temple prostitution, or patriarchal concerns with lineage rather than universal sexual ethics. Orthodox Judaism traditional interpretation generally maintains a traditional interpretation. The act described in Leviticus is prohibited. Celibacy is often prescribed for LGBTQ individuals. Same sex marriage is not recognized in Orthodox contexts, with rare exceptions. However, even within Orthodoxy, there is growing conversation about pastoral care for LGBTQ Jews. Many Orthodox rabbis emphasize compassion, dignity, and inclusion even while upholding legal restrictions. Some Orthodox scholars argue that orientation is not simple, only specific acts are restricted. Orthodox Judaism is not homogeneous, and its conversations continue to evolve. Conservative Judaism, the reinterpretation and inclusion of conservative Judaism, has undergone significant change in the last 20 years. The movement has embraced a more historical, critical approach to scripture, leading to acceptance of LGBTQ rabbis, recognition and performance of same sex marriages, a differentiation between ancient purity laws and modern ethical values, acknowledgement that Levitical laws served ancient societal functions and do not always reflect eternal moral principles. Conservative Jewish interpretation often emphasizes that modern understanding of sexual orientation differ fundamentally from ancient conceptions. Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism, fully affirming Reform Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism are broadly affirming. They ordain LGBTQ rabbis, they conduct same sex weddings, and they encourage full participation of LGBTQ individuals in all religious life. They interpret Levitical passages through historical context, not literal application. They prioritize ethical responsibility and personal integrity over ancient purity codes. These branches often view queer relationships as expressions of love, covenant, and sacred partnership. Jewish scholarship highlights beyond literalism, Jewish scholars bring several important insights to the topic. The Holiness Code is not a universal moral law. It regulates ritual purity, not the ethics of loving relationships. The ancient world lacked our modern understanding of sexual orientation. So, rabbinic literature often views same sex acts through cultural, not identity based categories. And then female same sex relationships were not prohibited in Torah. This absence signals that the text is not addressing sexual orientation, but specific cultural practices. Covenant relationships are central in Judaism. Many rabbis affirm that LGBTQ couples can reflect covenant law and responsibility. Queer presence in Jewish history, Judaism, like all religious traditions, has a long, complex history of queer lived experience. LGBTQ Jews have been part of Jewish communities for centuries. Modern Israel recognizes same sex couples in various civil structures. Some Jewish mystical traditions, the Kabbalah, explored gender fluidity and divine androgyny. Jewish literature, including modern poetry and prose, contains rich queer expression. Judaism's historical relationship with queerness is far more varied and nuanced than often assumed. So, In summary, Judaism does not have a single stance on homosexuality. Instead, it offers a spectrum ranging from traditional restrictions to full affirmation and celebration. The key takeaways is that the Levitical texts are part of ancient purity law and not universal moral doctrine. Many Jewish branches affirm LGBTQ identity and relationships. Jewish scholarship emphasizes context, covenant, and evolving ethical understanding. Queer Jews have always existed within Jewish communities. Judaism's interpretive flexibility demonstrates that sacred texts are not static but living documents. This diversity within Judaism provides a strong example of how religious traditions can evolve while remaining rooted in their sacred history. So, we're going to talk about a couple of other religions. So, there's Islam, like Judaism, is often portrayed as uniformly anti LGBTQ, but this is also not historically accurate. The Quran does not directly address sexual orientation. Interpretations of homosexuality in Islam primarily come from readings of the story of the Prophet Lot. Similar to the Christian interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah, many modern Islamic scholars argue that the sin of Lot's people were related to violence, inhospitality, and exploitation, not loving same sex relationships. They point out that the Quran condemns harmful sexual acts, but does not condemn consensual same sex love. Historically, Islamic civilizations had openly queer poets, scholars, and mystics. Same sex affection was a common subject in literature, including writings from Rumi, Abu Nuwas, and other iconic figures. Gender nonconforming individuals held spiritual and social roles in different Islamic regions. Today, there are emerging affirming Muslim communities around the world, including LGBTQ mosques and organizations that are dedicated to reconciling faith and identity. Islam's relationship with sexuality is shaped more by cultural norms and regional interpretations that, than by the Quran itself. So let's talk about Hinduism. It's one of the world's oldest and most diverse religions. It has no single holy book, no central authority, and no unified doctrine regarding sexuality. Instead, it contains a broad range of beliefs. Hindu texts and mythology include numerous examples of gender fluidity, same sex relationships, and divine beings who transcend traditional categories. For example, the deity Shiva merges with his consort Parvati to form Ardhashanrava, of half male, half female divine form. It also includes characters who change gender. The Kama Sutra references same sex attraction. The, the Hieros, a recognized third gender community, have held spiritual roles for centuries. Historically, queer identities were not stigmatized in Hindu culture until colonial influence imposed Western sexual norms on India. Today, many Hindu leaders support LGBTQ rights, and numerous temples openly welcome queer devotees. Hinduism largely approaches sexuality from a perspective of balance, intention, and spiritual energy, not moral condemnation. All right, and then there's Buddhism. Buddhism does not focus on sexuality in terms of sin. Its ethical teachings center on the principle of avoiding harm. The Buddha's instruction regarding sexual behavior is about consent, mindfulness, and reducing suffering because Buddhism does not rely on commandments about sexual orientation. It does not condemn queerness. LGBTQ monks, nuns, and lay people have existed in Buddhist communities for centuries. Many Buddhist teachers emphasize that orientation is irrelevant to enlightenment. What matters is compassion, intention, and the impact of one's action on oneself and others. Buddhist teachings offer a perspective where identity is neither judged nor elevated, but simply recognized as part of a human experience. And then you have the indigenous and African traditional religions. So this is before colonization. Many indigenous cultures across Africa and the Americas and the Pacific had rich understanding of gender and sexuality. In many Native American tribes, two spirit people held sacred roles as healers, mediators, and spiritual leaders. Their identities were honored, not condemned. Many African societies recognize same sex relationships or gender nonconforming individuals long before European contact. Examples appear in pre colonial Congo, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Uganda, and other regions. Third gender spiritual figures also existed in numerous African and Caribbean traditions. Homophobia in many African countries today is a result of imported colonial laws and missionary Christianity. The pre colonial cultures themselves were far more accepting. These traditions demonstrated that queerness has been woven into sacred life worldwide for thousands of years. And then lastly, we have the modern interfaith movements across the world. Many religious movements are becoming affirming. LGBTQ rabbis, imams, Buddhist teachers, priests, and spiritual leaders are emerging in traditions that previously lacked visibility. Faith communities are reevaluating their teachings in light of history, context, and compassion. This interfaith shift shows that spiritual understanding grows as societies grow. It also reveals that the global diversity of queer faith experiences. As we have explored, many world religions do not center homosexuality as a major spiritual issue. Some traditions affirm queer identities, others are neutral, and many focus more on harm, ethics, and compassion than on regulating sexual orientation. So, this raises a natural question. If so many religions do not treat homosexuality as a central moral concern, why did Christianity, and specifically Catholicism, place such heavy attention on it? The answer is not singular. It comes from a combination of historical, political, cultural, and theological factors that shaped Western Christianity over centuries. So, Christianity absorbed Jewish purity concerns, but then they applied them differently. Early Christianity inherited the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, but however, ancient Jewish communities did not treat Levitical purity laws as universal moral laws for the whole world. They were specific to Israel at a particular time. Judaism had extensive rabbinic interpretation that contextualized these laws. But as Christianity grew beyond its Jewish roots, many Gentile converts read the Hebrew scriptures literally without the benefit of Jewish interpretive tradition. This created a dynamic where certain texts, including Leviticus, were used as absolute moral commands instead of situational purity laws. Early Christian theologians linked sexuality and sin in a unique way. Christianity evolved during the Greco Roman era, which already had strong philosophical ideas about self control, purity, bodily discipline, suppression of desire. Early theologians, such as Augustine, heavily influenced Christian sexual ethics. Augustine's personal struggles with desire shaped his theology, leading him to teach that sexual desire itself was tied to original sin, and that sex was morally acceptable primarily for procreation. Anything non procreative became suspect. This framework positioned non procreative sex, including same sex relationships, as inherently sinful. Other religions did not experience the same theological development. The Catholic Church established rigid moral categories during the medieval period. Between the 12th and 6th centuries, the Catholic Church codified canon law. They developed moral theology, defined natural law through the writings of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas argued that since same sex acts could not lead to procreation, they violated natural law. This was not a biblical argument, it was a philosophical argument based on medieval biology and assumptions about the purpose of the body. These teachings became embedded in the Catholic doctrine and later influenced Protestant reformers. Christianity became intertwined with European political identity in medieval and early modern Europe. Christianity was the dominant institution. Morality became a tool for social control. Sexual behavior was regulated by the church to enforce stability, hierarchy, and conformity. The church's stance on sexuality became part of how society defined order and obedience. Other global religions, especially decentralized ones like Hinduism or Buddhism, did not assume this level of institutional control over personal life. And then colonialism spread Christian sexual ethics globally. European colonial powers imposed Christian morality, anti sodomy laws, Victorian sexual values, missionary teachings, Western gender norms. They, they forced it onto colonial nations across Africa, Asia, the Americas. In many places, homophobia today reflects colonial Christian influence, not original cultural beliefs. Many African countries, for example, inherited anti LGBTQ laws from British penal codes, not indigenous traditions. The modern era heightened sexual morality as a Christian identity marker. In the 20th century, fundamentalists, evangelists, I don't know what I can't say it. Evangelicalism, purity culture, and fears about social change, political alliances, all of that led many Christians to position sexual morality as a central component of Christian identity. Issues related to sex, gender, and family became litmus tests for those who were considered faithful. This was not how early Christianity operated, it was a modern cultural shift. Christianity is unique in how it merged theology with political lobbying. In the US, especially, the moral majority, Christian coalition, and evangelical voting blocs turned sexual topics, including homosexuality, into defining political issues. This political energy reinforced the idea that homosexuality is central to Christian morality, even though the Bible gives it very little attention compared to the other ethical issues. So, in summary, Christianity's focus is historical, not divinely mandated. When we step back and we look at the global picture, it becomes clear Christianity's emphasis on homosexuality is not universal among religions. It is not central in the teachings of Jesus, and it's not rooted in consistent biblical messaging. It developed through centuries of cultural, political, and philosophical evolution. Colonialism carried these interpretations throughout the world. In contrast, many other religions focus far more on harm, justice, balance, compassion, ethical intention, non-violence, excuse me, rather than policing of sexuality. Thus, Christianity's unique focus is better explained by historical forces than by spiritual necessity. So, Before we close, here are a few questions I want you to reflect on throughout this week. What beliefs about what beliefs about homosexuality did you inherit specifically from Christianity? And which of those beliefs came from culture rather than scripture? How does learning about other religious traditions reshape my understanding of sexuality, identity, and what is considered natural or sacred? In what ways has Christianity's historical emphasis on sexual morality influenced my personal view of God, myself, or others? Where do I see colonial, cultural, or political influences shaping what I was told about biblical truth? How does the global diversity of religious perspectives invite me to think differently about my own faith and spiritual journey? Thank you for joining today's Sacred Conversations. I hope this exploration of global religious perspectives has offered you a broader understanding of spirituality and a clearer sense of how cultural history and interpretation shape our beliefs. Excuse me. As you reflect on today's questions, take time this week to consider where your ideas about sexuality and faith originally came from and how learning about other traditions can open new pathways for understanding God, yourself, and the world. Remember to like and subscribe so these conversations can continue to reach those who are searching for clarity, connection, and truth. I look forward to having you with me next week as we take a fresh look at the Nativity, its cultural context, its symbolism, and what the birth of Jesus means for people who have often been pushed to the margins of church spaces. Until then, stay grounded, stay curious, and stay in love.